This sharing session is our first endeavor in connecting with the Holacracy community, and we appreciate all of you joining us today. My name is Eric Lundquist, and I'm a partner at encode.org, and specifically for this event, I hold the events logistics and inbound hospitality roles, and I'm going to be hosting the session today. So just some more logistics. The chat box, feel free to use the chat box if you have questions or comments. We'll be using the chat box throughout the session. And everyone can see everything that's in the chat session, but we'll use that to reference and harvest tensions as we can continue the conversation throughout the meeting. We'll be breaking into small groups into the session. Breakout rooms. We'll be doing very small groups of about 3 people. I'll put you into a breakout session. You'll get a notice on your screen that you have to enter. And then when you click on that, it will put you into the breakout session, and we'll frame up what actually will happen in those in a little bit. But logistically, that's how it will work. Again, if you have questions or need anything, just go ahead and put something in the chat box, and I'll be monitoring that throughout the session. Again, this is our first interaction with the Holacracy community. We're excited and intrigued to learn from you all. And so as that is one of the reasons, Holacracy was one of the reasons that encode.org was formed. So let me turn it over now to Tom Thomison. Tom is a partner and one of the founders at encode.org. He's a seasoned entrepreneur and business builder with more than 30 years of experience, and Tom is a recognized leader in self-organized practices and is also the co-founder of Holacracy One. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Tom.
Hey, thanks, Eric. Good to hang out with the Holacracy tribe. Really looking forward to this session and hearing how this lands with everybody that's present. And I'm recording, so folks that registered that aren't here will be able to jump in and have a listen too. So yeah, I'm really anxious to share what we've been up to at encode.org. As Eric said, I'm one of the 3 founding members. We're kind of using even different language there of starting up a new venture. One of the things that encode is, much like Holacracy One was and still is a living laboratory, trying things on ourselves. We're the lab rats and the guinea pigs, seeing what works and what doesn't, and then trying to write stuff down, the stuff that does, at least for now, and to systematize this approach, which included the startup process. So one of the things that we're offering or charting new territory around is how do you start up a brand new venture that's completely for purpose. So I am one of the 3 founding members of this venture. We had some other contributors along the way, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we frame up what we're doing here. We've got about 25 minutes or so. I'm gonna try not to kill you with slides, but give you some visuals and just anchor some scaffolding to anchor some of the conversation around, so you can see what we're talking about when we think of or mention the for-purpose enterprise. And that'll run for about 20-25 minutes or so. I'd love to hear from you. I'm completely interruptible, so feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions at any point along the way. Some of you have heard this before. I'm going to change up a little bit, go faster, not cover things that I know the Holacracy community already knows. And then I'll go a little bit deeper on things that I typically don't hit in a general, more public setting where folks are less familiar with Holacracy. So I'm going to feel free to use complete Holacracy language and use all the principles and practices therein to describe what we're doing. I'm assuming that most all of you are at least Holacracy aware, if not already practicing. So this is for Holacracy practitioners, licensed providers, and coaches. It's really meant to orient that community to this work. And so with that, I'm going to share my screen, which means I will lose seeing all of your beautiful faces, and I'll be staring just at a presentation. So let me get my screen share up and talk about what we're doing here at Encode. We're framing this, there's a lot of stuff being written now about the so-called new world of work, right? And I've been living in this self-organizing space for over a decade. Eric, I'm assuming this is coming through okay? You'll let me know otherwise.
Yep, looks great. Looks great, Tom.
Yeah, so the fundamental, the foundational premise is this whole self-organizing journey has been ongoing and continues, has been going on for quite some time, I should say. I usually have a slide here looking at the early pioneers, Gore, Simcoe, Morningstar, a bunch of others, and then how that segues into the Holacracy move and Fred's book on reinventing organization. So self-organization has been happening for a few decades. And I know even in the Holacracy practitioner courses, from time to time, Brian will mention that, you know, this movement of Holacracy is really just the first clearing of a really big forest. There's a lot of work to do. And even though we've been at this for about a decade in the Holacracy community, we're only really just beginning to fully distribute and push the bounds of that distribution of authority to the endpoints. And so the framing that we use at Encode is the self-organization journey continues in this new world of work. And of course, for us in the Holacracy community, this is not new news, but what I tried to do here, and we've done at Encode, is to distill down some of the key shifts that the Holacracy Constitution has encoded. And I think one of the gifts that Holacracy brings to the world is a written down constitution. It's the chief offering, if you will. There's a lot of expressions of that offering, from glass frog to trainings to deployments and so on. But the Constitution represents the full body encoding, the rule set for self-organizing the work. And a lot of folks talk about the different movements that are out there, teal, responsive, sociocracy even, but don't give you a how-to manual. Holacracy, on the other hand, does give us a very concrete how-to manual in the form of the Constitution. And there are some key principles embedded in that Constitution. We've distilled out 5 of them: purposeful, holarchic, dynamic, autonomous, and transparent. I usually spend quite a bit of time on this with folks, but I won't spend so much with you guys here. Everything, as you know, in Holacracy hangs on purpose. This is a purposeful endeavor. And the thing I love about evolutionary purpose is that it's action-oriented. It is about taking steps and choosing paths, figuring out what's needed now and moving into next always. And I have a little pithy statement. You guys that know me well know that I'm full of these pithy statements. In my world, purpose is as purpose does. There's always purpose. There's always a sense of purpose. Sometimes you have a really good sense of your own purpose and can articulate it well. Sometimes you're totally baffled and clueless, me included, on how to articulate your purpose. But you can always get a clue on what your purpose is in the doing, in the next step you take in your actions. So purposeful is the first and key element in this new world of work, in this world of self-organizing the work. Holarchic, no-brainer here. There's a new structure. I get to present to a lot of folks all over the world, and it still amazes me the notion that flat organizational structures are kind of what we're pointing to. It just baffles me that a decade in, that folks aren't grokking the fact that we're talking about a replacement of one hierarchy for another. Holacracy is, of course, always about holarchic structures. And the work that Encode is doing is figuring out how to take that and bake it into some other 2 systems that I'll talk about later. So this actually holds the power shift. The other thing that baffles me still, after a decade of doing this, is lots of folks will come at this work, even when we're talking about the work of Encode, as tinkering on existing management structures, somehow trying to make them incrementally better. And of course, everybody on this call that's either here now or tuning in later knows that Holacracy is a complete replacement for management hierarchy. This becomes really super important when we talk about upgrading some other systems. So holarchic, this is how we frame it, 5 principles. These are baked into the Constitution. That's why I'm reviewing them here with you. These, you don't have to remember them. You don't even have to figure out how to enact them. If you practice the rule set, if you play the game, you express these principles because they're baked in. Dynamic, of course, by all the names that we've grown to love and describe. Dynamic processes, whether it be sense and respond, or agile or lean, whatever, dynamic steering, of course, just dynamic processes moving away from predict and control structures. And those are, of course, encoded really deeply in the Constitution. Providing for a high degree of freedom or autonomy, being able to lead your work and following others that are leading their work. So this is a self-organizing structure for the work in pursuit of purpose. Those of you that know me know that these are my go-to phrases to really anchor this. And we get to express that work with a great degree of freedom and autonomy in the roles that we hold. So this is another key element, a key principle that we want to see incorporated in some of the other areas that I'll be talking about. So autonomy, rules in service of freedom, as I sometimes say, and then everything is transparent. Of course, a high degree of radical transparency, as much transparency as you can possibly stomach. Glass Frog is a great example of that, to see the insides of the organization where there are no privileged classes or sacred spaces or silos where you can't look into, no black boxes kind of things. So these are the 5, right? And this comes from a decade of practice and working inside Holacracy 1 and helping others shift to this new way of structuring the work. And part of my story as one of the co-founders of Holacracy 1 and having the privilege of doing this work is I got to see how real folks responded to this new rule set and the transformation and operational efficiencies and all the other things that we desire, the engagement that we get by not seeking it and so on, when we shift to this system, which is way cool. So I wouldn't work any other way. I am totally all in on self-organizing the work in this fashion. But that said, I noticed in doing the work, and you probably have too, that there are some lingering tensions, tensions broader than just the work. And that's actually the crux of our time together here. So as I start talking now about the work of encode, I want you to start thinking about maybe your own experience of practice, either coaching or deploying, implementing, or just your own personal practice experience of where these principles, the purposeful, holarchic, dynamic, transparent, and autonomous principles start to fall off or are not present, and conventional power structures are. So power shifts. That is the game we're playing. We're actually shifting to a new power system. And that power system is fully distributed, fully self-organized via the Constitution for the work as a replacement for management hierarchy, but it doesn't extend to a couple other systems. So my experience with Holacracy is we've done a really good job of self-organizing the work, but by design, on purpose, with conscious intent, we did not address some of the other systems, like power shifts showing up in the legal and equity structures, in the profit sharing systems, in the culture. Of course, Holacracy in that holarchic structure, the organizational holarchy contains accountabilities and roles into circles and circles into broader circles, all for purpose. It does not contain directly people in that organizational holarchy. So a common concern or lament or question is, where do the people show up, and what about culture? And how do you lead your work when you're not leading or managing people? Anyway, these are a set, and the question marks are anchors for you to think about tensions that you're experiencing in the broader space of the work. Because organizational work shows up with people, of course, energizing the work. And people, humans, love to be in relationship with one another and have healthy relationships and be able to process tensions when those relationships cause friction. Another one of the critiques that Holacracy gets often, all the time actually, is there's no attention processing for people. And of course, that is again by design. That doesn't mean that it's unimportant or unnecessary. It just means it doesn't belong in the organizational hierarchy. And apologies if this is old territory for many of you, but just to set the frame of why encode. It was to address these evolutionary tensions, right? So something new was emerging. We had a lot of success, 10 years of success, self-organizing the work in pursuit of purpose, putting in a replacement for management hierarchy, but we'd left a couple systems behind, the way I think about it and the way encode thinks about it. We left the company, the legal structure, that's the sphere in the top left, and the people, or what we call the association structure, behind. There were not really good answers that embraced those 5 principles in our legal and capital structures and our people and cultural systems. So after working over the last 2.5 years, encode has evolved new rule sets, new practices, and new ways to think about the broader work in a holistic system from end to end, something that we call the 4-purpose enterprise. And the 4-purpose enterprise has these 3 components. The organization, of course, is familiar space for all of us Holacracy folk. Its focus is always the work. Nothing gets in the way of getting the work done. We're self-organizing the work in pursuit of purpose, and it has a rule set, the Constitution. And that Constitution informs how to manage and control and structure that work. So what we want to do now is to integrate those 2 systems that we've kind of left behind. One way to think about Holacracy, I think of anyway, is a differentiation event, right? From the conventional to the post-conventional, we differentiated the organization from our conventional definitions into something separate, something distinct from the people and the other structures. Now it's time to reintegrate that. So the company is a reintegration, where Holacracy was a distinction event. We're now reintegrating the legal structure, something that we call the company. And the focus there is actually the property or assets. So it's who owns what? What are the investment stakes at play? How do you deal with capital structures and profit sharing and liability? And the whole notion of ownership needs to be redefined. How can you claim to own a self-organizing autonomous entity like the organization when it's free to pursue its own purpose? So I'll have more to say about that here in a moment, but the company is the container that we hold for the legal issues, the legal structures. And then another container or context, if you will, for the people. And it too needs a rule set, the association agreement. And these are the constructs that encode has been working on. We've actually created over 9 agreements and counting to help encode these principles in those 2 systems left behind. So let me dig in a little bit deeper in the 10 minutes or so we have before we break out and discuss in our smaller groups. Let's kind of just look at this diagram, less conceptually, but more now how this all ties together. So we're using, in fact, we're leaning on heavily the Holacracy Constitution as 21st century governance. In other words, I don't think we could possibly contemplate upgrading the legal structures and the people structures if we didn't have a solid, mature 21st century governance system to integrate the perspectives needed at the broadest level of scale. And that broadest level of scale, as all of you know, is defined and delineated in the anchor circle. So we use Holacracy's construct of the anchor circle as the key integration point, steering evolutionary purpose. So the anchor circle holds all of this together, and it is the replacement, legally so, for the conventional board. So in our legal structure, we ditch the board, we get rid of officers and directors, we change the definition of shareholders, we shift the fiduciary away from purpose, or I'm sorry, exactly the opposite of that. We shifted away from profit to purpose. And we tie it all together in the anchor circle. So you can see there's a context cross-link, if you will, here. This is in Article 5 of the Article 5 of the Constitution on adoption matters, where you can adopt with cross-links into the anchor circle. This gets encoded in the operating agreement, where we have the investor context and the association context, integrating the needs of the investors or the asset holders, and integrating the needs of the people, finally, as people, separate and outside the organizational hierarchy, as a way of integrating those perspectives into the steering of evolutionary purpose. And then, of course, we have the general role and the rep link role. And we've been playing with different operational roles inside the anchor circle. And we think that there's at least 3 or 4. An operating agreement role to keep it current, a association agreement role to keep that agreement current, and interestingly enough, not compensation in this system, but an earnings plan and an earnings plan design. So comp, as it's formally known, actually lives in the anchor circle, because what you're actually using are the assets of the company, the profit interest and the capital interest and some others, to craft your earnings plan. So this is kind of how all this ties together: assets, the work, and the people. Obviously, up in the organizational context, nothing really needs to be said there. Constitution at play, expressing work and pursuit of purpose. Over on the right-hand side on your screen, you can see the people context. It does have a circle, by definition, a holacracy-based circle. Actually, it's a new anchor circle to do the work of the association container or association context. And we've labeled that the operation circle. So there is a circle inside that context to do the work of the people. And these are all the usual suspects of people-related issues on recruiting and onboarding and offboarding, and finding new people, recruiting, I guess I said already. But anything having to do with the management of the people as a collective, not as members of the organizational hierarchy, live in that operation circle. And that gets a representation across link in the anchor circle as well. And you can see a couple other constructs, something that we call special interest groups and guilds. We won't say too much about that. I'm not going to dig into too much more detail here, but just to give you a sense that there's a lot of meat on this. This is fully fleshed out and connects to Holacracy's constitutional elements, and we write some new rule sets. In fact, I said we have about 9 of them. We have new rules for encoding self-organization legally. So we have the founding member agreement. That actually is the document that tells the story of individual entrepreneurs coming together to launch a self-organizing for-purpose enterprise. We have an operating agreement. I'm going to actually break out and give you just a glimpse of that operating agreement here. I'm going to head out of screen share or full screen, and hopefully you can see that.
Yep, looking good. Yep.
Okay. And I might blow that up a little bit if I don't blow other things up. So this is in version 2. And we started with kind of some of the pioneering work we did at Holacracy 1 on rewriting the legal structure, the LLC structure. And we used that as a baseline. When we launched encode.org about 2.5 years ago, we did a complete rewrite of that agreement to kind of update it and freshen it up with some of these new structures in mind. Since then, we've continued to improve that, and we've now completely restructured the agreement and have new terms in here. So we are defining some things that are brand new to the for-purpose enterprise structure, a new class of membership unit that encodes the slicing pie model. Those of you familiar with that, the dynamic allocation, equity allocation process. We have a new term called due governance, which is used to point to the due authority making or decision making authority of the enterprise and where due governance lives in the anchor circle. We actually define now the for-purpose enterprise as a specific entity and structure, tying together these three components. And individual purpose is identified here. You won't find that in other agreements. And so it goes. So this session is not to dig into that, this document in detail, but I wanted to give you a glimpse that we have brand new definitions, and we're in our second version of this document, about to adopt it at encode.org. And this becomes the template by which we're going to other jurisdictions around the world and taking those 5 principles and how they get blown out into, 50 pages of legalese in the Netherlands and Austria and Switzerland and Ukraine and elsewhere in the world. We're working with attorneys and law firms and tax advisors and financial professionals to rethink our current legal structures and people structures. And these are all held in the agreements. So back to self-organizing, the legal agreements, we have operating agreements, membership grant agreements, we rethink confidentiality and IP. The association agreement is a brand new construct that provides the rules of the road for the culture, the social norms, the interaction of us humans. And what do we agree to come together as a collective who are interested in serving a purpose greater than ourselves, the enterprise purpose. So all of that comes together in these agreements, and this is how we're making the for-purpose enterprise real. So this is not going beyond holacracy. That actually drives me nuts when I hear that. There's a lot of folks claiming to go beyond holacracy. I have no idea what that means. There may be alternate ways of self-organizing the work as a replacement for management hierarchy. I will be really curious to see those. Sociocracy comes really close, I think, as a replacement for management hierarchy, but still kind of encodes some power structures personally. So holacracy to date is the only mature 21st century governance system that I feel we can reliably trust to integrate the needs of an entire enterprise, because it has a written down rule set. It replaces management hierarchy completely, and it encodes no personal power holding. It's that last one that others I don't think really are on board with. So when folks talk about beyond holacracy, it's like, I don't think anybody's caught up with those 3 yet to go beyond. And we're not trying to go beyond, we're upgrading 2 systems that have yet to be upgraded. We're trying to bring those up to date, not go beyond anything. We're trying to reintegrate them into 21st century self-organizing principles. So that was fast. That was a whirlwind. It was kind of meant to be to get you thinking about this new world of work and your own holacracy practice as maybe a licensee deployer or a coach or a practitioner, so that you can begin to think about where your tensions either are personally or organizationally or possibly with your clients. And with that, we're going to move into a breakout session. I'm going to stop my screen share and talk about what's next. So we've got about 15 minutes for you all to share in smaller groups. And I'd like for you to focus on 3 things. So when you're in your smaller group, feel free to introduce yourself, kind of what's your background and your level of play, maybe your experience with the practice. Reflect on this framing, and then share your own experiences related to these power shifts not being fully embraced in the end. where your lingering tensions are or your client's lingering tensions are. And then collect ideas, maybe offering pitches to Encode on what we can do to make that better, or questions that might come up that we could explore collectively. So essentially you'll be building an agenda, harvesting your tensions or ideas in your small breakout session, and then we'll come back together and integrate those separate agenda items into a bigger group discussion and triage them one at a time and see what's needed. So that's the exercise for about the next 15 minutes. And we have some logistic roles that will break us out into small groups. And you'll have about 15 minutes to dig in. All right, so back now in the main room. I'll be curious to see what kind of thoughts, tensions, questions, ideas came up. And where are those, Eric, that we can look at now and kind of dig in a bit?
They're in the chat, but I don't see any in there. So
okay.
If you intentions, if you just put them in the chat window, and then we can talk about those.
So I was wanting to ask something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so with this enterprise, which is through the anchor circle, which I understood, is it going to be run by the Holacracy constitution, or you're creating another constitution?
So we're creating 2 new rule sets. It is run organizationally by the Holacracy constitution. Holacracy constitution self-organizes the work, replaces the management hierarchy, and specifies the anchor circle. All of that is constitutional. Holacracy constitution.
Anchor circle is already part of Holacracy constitution. Yeah.
It is. Yep. And so we rely on that structure as part of the legal upgrade and the people upgrade as the key integration point and the replacement for the board construct.
So if you use this structure, you are also like bound or whatever by the Holacracy licenses and things like that.
Well, Holacracy is free to practice by anyone in the world, so that you don't have to pay anybody anything for the use of that.
But if you're coaching somebody in this, then you need a license.
Well, so that's an interesting question. Let's deconstruct it a bit. So I did say very fast that Holacracy is the only mature 21st century governance system that we can reliably count on, because it does 3 things. It has a fully written down rule set, it completely replaces management hierarchy, and it encodes power systemically, not personally. So Holacracy is a prerequisite for this. That's 1. Encode is not a Holacracy license provider. Encode will not deploy Holacracy or help clients practice Holacracy. Yet it is a requirement to take the next step into the for-purpose enterprise, which is why we're talking to this community. Because the Holacracy community, the coaches and the license providers, are going to be critically needed for good Holacracy practice. And to the extent that if you're in the business of deploying Holacracy with clients for commercial gain, then yes, you need to be participating in Holacracy One's licensing program.
Great. So it's like an add-on. I mean, I don't know if that's the right word, but it's like something. Yeah, I mean, you were talking of beyond and other things, but it's like that's a prerequisite for it. I hear that.
It is a prerequisite, yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can't do the things that we need to do in the other 2 systems without something like Holacracy in place.
I would say it's complementary what we do soon.
For
Oops, you broke up there a bit. Can you repeat?
Who do you talk to?
Shami. Yeah. Can you repeat that? You broke up on my end. I'm sorry.
No.
I think you said that the complementary system or something. Did you say that?
Yeah, no, I said, yeah, I just interjected, I'm sorry, jumped in and said, I think what we're doing is complementary to Holacracy practice, kind of, yeah, so fills the gaps, it fills some of the gaps, and yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just, yeah, one way of seeing it.
Great, thanks. Yeah.
So
Tom, you have a couple other tensions there in the chat box.
yeah, so
Can you see those, or do you need me?
you said curious to know more about how you deal with personal conflicts in the association domain. Yeah, that was one of the key motivations for upgrading the people structure. The answer to that lies in the association agreement. So the association agreement encodes rules for conflict resolution, feedback, and tension processing between people. So in a session, maybe we'll schedule a future session and dig into the association agreement and look at the areas where it deals with personal conflict. So in the organizational system, we deal with role conflict. And there's a really strong push to get super clear on the difference between personal conflict and role conflict, or organizational conflict. And Holacracy does not address personal conflict. And this causes a lot of people a lot of tension because we're used to having personal conflict dealt with in the organization space. And this is one of those distinctions, this differentiation. And so Holacracy is silent on the personal conflict. That's unimportant. It's just not addressed in the organization's holarchy. It needs to be addressed elsewhere. And so organizations practicing Holacracy all over the world figure out how to address the people issues. And there's dozens of approaches to doing that. What the for-purpose enterprise does is say that the people live in a separate holarchy, a separate structure. And it's in that structure that's governed by the association agreement, where we deal with behavior norms, culture, and interpersonal conflict.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah, yes. Well, let's touch base with our agenda holder first. Make sure you got what you needed, or do you have?
Yeah, just a reflection that it requires pretty mature organizational members. Speaking from experience in a community I've been part of for 2 decades, even making clear that there is in our community a distinction between the ownership structure and the community structure. That's been uphill for 2 decades. With average, I would say average people interested in meditation.
Yeah, it's a classic conundrum. But honestly, there's a paradoxical answer here. When you encode these principles, the 5 principles and others in the rules, you can rely on them to help you express the capacities needed. So you don't have to rely on personal development, right? So you rely on the rule set to help give you guidance on what to do when something happens.
It sounds like you apply healthy blue to substitute requirements for green personal development, and people can do the personal development if they want to, but otherwise there's a fallback option to rules.
I'm glad that's recorded. I want to use that snippet. That's exactly right. Yes, the last part, the color part, I get it, but the last part, yes. Development gets to happen much more naturally from the doing of the work, not as a projection or demand on someone. It actually comes much more naturally, organically, I would say, healthily, as you would say.
And do I get it right? The prototype you have is your own organization, but there are only few or no other actual implementations right now?
A few. So encode.org Evolution at Work is probably the next most mature practitioner of the for-purpose enterprise, and we have 2 folks on the call here, or did, in that organization. We had another company in Colorado, and we've got a couple more in Europe. So it's a handful, a dozen or so that have been experimenting with these, and that is beginning to get some traction. Anything else on your question about those conflicts? Okay. Shamini, did you have a question related to that before I go to the next?
So it's like, I mean, I see the tension, experience it also around culture, you know, for example, in a culture where power is like very skewed, you know, so it will be difficult for people to express things, you know, to somebody with authority. And around caste or color or different things can play, and education and which language you speak, or, you know. So I do see like these dynamics, and what in my journey I've understood that it's important to name them. That okay, that in our organization there are people from different age groups, and something plays in that, and there's also a value in people who are more experienced to give their inputs, and at the same time respecting authority and autonomy of everybody, you know. So,
yeah, it's super important and not as needed as a useful leverage point inside the organizational space, because we have clear rules of engagement on how power is distributed. The actual learning opportunity is stepping in to use your own authority, because there is no personal power holder, but that unlearning doesn't happen overnight.
So to support that unlearning, this other circle is there. Can I say that?
Yes, in a big part. Yeah. And organizations, for example, Evolution at Work, and other organizations in general, I think will need to come into the world to help all of us work differently in this new world of work. We're identifying new progression paths, new development paths, new skills and capacities to do this kind of work. And there'll be organizations that will be helping all of us along that journey, and no longer relying on the organization to do that for us. So this is
it means that each organization is going to define or decide their own ways of dealing with conflicts, and somebody might say we want to use restorative circles, somebody might say we want to use NVC, somebody might say we want to have a mediation.
I'm going to have to ask you to so you're completely breaking up. You'll either have to repeat the question.
I'll shut off my video, it will be better.
Okay, great.
So each organization will do its own way. Some might say that we want to use restorative circles for our conflict resolution. Some might choose...
Not if they're practicing holacracy, just to interrupt. That's not on the rule set. It's one of the beautiful things.
I know that won't be in the rule set, but in the association part, each organization will decide what is their strategy for dealing with the personal and cultural things.
Absolutely. So in that agreement, the association agreement, there are elements that we feel are core and the same for all for-purpose enterprises. And then there are custom elements, directly to your point, like nonviolent communication, I heard you say, or other means for mediation or helping to understand self and other better. So that will, again, arise much more organically and naturally based on the type of individuals that have come together to serve that purpose greater than themselves.
And to deal with it also, we will have roles, and again in a holacratic setup like that. So even in the association, are we going to have holacracy, or?
Only in part. And the part that we have holacracy is the operational part to do the work of the association. And we didn't dig into it very much at all. The guilds and the special interest groups are containers where we can have these kind of human to human or team group interactions and dynamics. So it's the guilds and the special interest groups that actually serve as the container for this kind of developmental work.
Great, because we are also coming closer to these conclusions, and we work on NVC and restorative circles and holacracy. So when there's a tension which we can't handle with holacracy, there's a total breakdown sometimes, and we go to restorative circles and try it through that, you know.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
So great. So we'll catch up more on this later sometime.
Great, that sounds fun. All right, so Keith, I think you're next up. Teaching, training, and supporting humans of various types in holacracy. Not just interpersonal tensions are valuable, but how to help individuals, introverts, cultural, demographic groups who may find holacracy more challenging with a steep learning curve. So
and the only thing I think I would add is, you know, some of what Shami was addressing is also at play here, right? In that culture, language, demographic, age, all affects an individual communication style, personality, all of that is at play. We as humans, we're all present wherever we are, all different aspects. And there are some qualities in the individual that can affect their ability to practice holacracy or to implement and learn it. And I call introversion as one thing that's not really demographic or cultural, but it's a good example to say if someone that's an introvert might have more difficulty bringing attention about it, especially if it's, say, with somebody that's got founder energy or previous supervisor manager energy going on, or if they're just a big ego, a big personality. And then what if process breakdown occurs? And then the introvert is kind of basically told by the holacracy structure, hey, deal with it. You know, you have attention. It's your responsibility to process that. And if the other person isn't doing it on their own, there's nobody around but you to do it. So get on with it.
Well, yeah,
right?
Yeah, there's a couple things going on there. Your point's well taken, for sure. But holacracy was designed with developmental perspective-taking capacities in mind, and interaction style preferences, introversion, extroversion in mind, psychological type preferences, cognitive dynamic preferences. These are all baked into the core decision-making process. So integrative decision-making accounts for all kinds and varieties of styles. And if it's being done well, if it's being facilitated well, there will always be a space comfortable for any particular style. That doesn't mean that that person is comfortable yet, but there will always be a space that is comfortable, that is allowed and inviting and available. And this is part of the deployment and practice and implementation process of getting people to let go of those habits and inertia, to check in with the former bosses and authority figures, to drop the fear of using their own voice. This is straight up holacracy deployment stuff. And this happens in every single deployment all over the world, always. And process breakdown is designed to intervene when the facilitation process or the rules aren't being adhered to for just the reason you pointed to, because that does harm, right? If you don't follow the rules, then this is a colossal waste of time and energy and effort, and it does harm, and you should toss it out. So if you're not going to live by the rules, stop, right? This is not a halfway, kind of half measure sort of thing. So you either have to work to improve your practice. Nobody's perfect, but there has to be a commitment to get ever better at practice, not to sidestep the rules. And if a power holder or a former power holder steps in and trumps or overstates, it's the whole system collapses. And that's one of the early power shift issues in early holacracy deployment. So that's a straight up holacracy practice.
Well, I hear you say that, but I don't see anything in the holacracy material that teaches orgs how to help the individual. You know, if the individual can't utilize,
I know,
right? And
yeah.
we've got demographic groups that are then culturally oppressed, and then they're in, they're kind of facing their oppressor, so to speak. And that oppressor happens to be the individual that's in the role that they need something from. I mean, I hear what you're saying. Yeah, it's baked in, but it also says pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get it done. And I don't get where in a standard implementation we're supposed to learn how to accommodate those or go through those challenges.
Yeah, it's again, a great point, and you're absolutely right. It is nowhere in the rule set. What it becomes is a tension. And every organization addresses that tension somewhat differently. And that's the way it should be, in my opinion. You should process, that tension should surface, and when it surfaces, it should be integrated, dealt with and integrated. And a good Holacracy coach or a good Holacracy deployment organization or implementer will help you deal with the people issues in a way that is compatible with the rule set.
Yeah.
And concretely, what happens is people circles show up, right? Or the old human resources or OD departments get refactored. And they start addressing these kind of issues in a new way, in a way that honors both the rules of practice and play and the personal tensions that come about by that practice. And so that's a good, on the spectrum of good, better, and best practice, that moves from really kind of dysfunctional and conventional to good to better. But Encode is saying best practice is to take that whole conversation and put it in a separate space designed for Keith, you and I, to hang out together. And when we disagree, support one another and have rules of engagement that develop and catalyze or cultivate intimacy. And that belongs outside the organizational structure. And that's what the for-purpose enterprise is bringing to bear, is a new space for us to show up, not as employees, not as hybrid partner employees, but as equals who care about something that we have in common, a common purpose.
And can I add something to this? You have time?
Just one second though. Let me just make sure, again, same pattern, Keith. Is that beginning to address, or maybe?
I get, especially in the acknowledgement that it needs to sit out. There are parts of this that need to sit outside of what the Holacracy structure has inherently available. And I get what you're saying also about that at some point it becomes a tension. Before the tension is surfaced, that's where it is. There's almost a blame the victim responsibility on the person that is having difficulty surfacing the tension. And until that person, right, has either the support outside of the Holacracy structure, or there are roles and people circles baked in that help to beef up the training and understanding for the partners so that they get that surfacing the attention is welcomed and necessary. Until that happens, then it is unfortunately a rigged game.
Yes, and on a separate call, I would redirect you to Christiana Suscheuler and Evolution at Work, because that's exactly what they want to do, is to help that address that tension, is provide pathways and support structures for people at whatever developmental stage they find themselves to show up in this new way of working and to feel healthy and whole and safe and own the power that they're invited to wield and use. So that's why you're pointing to really juicy and cool tensions that I think are surfacing the need for new organizations to address that need.
Great, thank you.
And again, Shami, you had a comment or question related.
Just a comment that, I mean, I resonate with what is going on, that Holacracy implementation itself needs a lot of learning at all fronts and to come at all places at the same time almost. I've experienced it because, and some of the tensions are addressed in the Holacracy process. For example, the person who has an authority also, if they would be asked the questions of whether the tension is valid or not in the 5 questions. And so that can take care of their authority when they are also questioned about the validity. So there are many things which which we were not doing properly. But when I started learning about it more, then I'm also realizing that a lot of these tensions can be processed within the holacracy structure also.
Yeah. Again, this goes to just a good practice. There's a place for everything. Yeah. So including testing a proposal, which is one way of validating the tension, you might say. Yeah. All right. So Dennis brings up a real good point: role relationships versus relationships. Yep.
It was just more of a comment, just to add on to what we were saying earlier. Just it wasn't a really question.
Yeah, it's a key distinction. Holacracy is all about the relationships at play and the tensions between roles. Again, I think this is so powerful, so subtle. But when conflict happens, getting work done, and it always happens, getting work done. We do it all the time. I'm one of the chief shit stirrers, right? And it causes role tension. But it's not about personality conflicts. It's about we don't know how to get the work done in the roles that we have structured. And it's a organizational tension. And it invites us to get better clarity about restructuring the organization's work. It's not about personality conflicts.
It's really impersonal. Anyone would feel the same tension if they were in your shoes, in your role shoes. So it's like really impersonal. Like, it's good to remember.
It is.
Freak out.
All right. And they're curious to learn more about the technological side of encoding self-organization legally. How does the state of the art look? What you got going there?
Yeah, I hope it doesn't go too much out of scope of the discussion, but as a technology consultant, very interested into the topic of holacracy. I was doing some research and discovered encode, and so now I'm just curious also to learn about the state of the art of the technology and to what extent it can already help organizations today to encode this kind of principles.
Yeah, I love that question. I think this is a super rich territory for us to dig into and mature around. A good example is, so the use of the term technology, right? If we broaden that, the Constitution is a technology. It's a set of rules, it's an algorithm, sometimes an evolutionary algorithm it's called, right? To encode organizational structure based on tension processing. So the rule set itself is technology. And then there's the software encoding of that, Glassfrog, Holospirit, others, which is vitally important. But one comes before the other. So the rule set are the use cases and the design, essentially, for encoding that in software. Where we are with Encode's work is we're paying attention to the underlying technology. What are the operating agreements, the founding member agreements, the confidentiality IP agreements, member grant agreements, and all that kind of stuff, to serve as the basis then to express that in software. And for us, we have a unique way of thinking about this because of two things. We're talking about legal agreements now between one or more parties. And we have a brand new emerging technology platform explicitly designed to hold agreements, right? And so all the, the hyperbole about blockchain is true, really, but it's in search of great applications. So we're looking at the legal agreements as the application that gets encoded, and we make those agreements smart, and then we store them in a place that is suitable for those kind of legal agreements. That's one part. The other part that actually is, I think, even more profound and more exciting is the technology again, the legal agreements. They specify assets. So they specify currency, essentially. And those actually encode the rules for how that currency operates. And down the line, Encode hopes to be able to create a cryptocurrency mobile enterprise. Advantage of the latest to do that. I see my internet might be unstable.
Sorry to interrupt. Could you cut out a little bit there? Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so just to rewind about 15 seconds. So the legal agreements specify the assets, and the assets become a form of currency. And again, currency is a great place to put in the blockchain and make that a cryptocurrency or a token. And so this is the longer term, and I would love it to be nearer term.
Oh, looks like we're losing Tom again. Tom, can you flip your video off maybe?
Well, all right, maybe we'll get good internet here and you can hear me at least. All right. So yes, the base technology we're focusing on right now to get the rules ready to be encoded in software.
Very interesting. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Right. Downsides of nomadic travel, you can never know what kind of internet connection you're going to get. All right. We're coming up on the end of our time. I don't see any other questions yet in the chat. Any top of mind questions from anybody?
Just one in your, do you think that things like absence coordination, vacation requests, stuff like that, do you think that lives, at least in your construct, does it live in the association context or in the, like, what did you call it, a member agreement or partner agreement? How do you handle things like that that are logistic, but they are also where people have to interact?
Yeah, it's a place where they intersect.
Mm-hmm.
So in the for-purpose enterprise structure, we claim that the answer to that question originates in the association container with the individual who makes a conscious choice about how much energy she or he wishes to contribute towards the purpose. That's the starting point, the origination point. And the agreement is held there, the membership agreement. And then the ongoing agreement of how much energy is available. So that has to meet organizational requirements or not, which bridges us right back over into operational issues about, do you have enough or too much resource? And how are you balancing the cost of those resources and availability? That becomes an organizational tension that must align with the individual who is bringing specific skills, talents, or capacities. But the origination point, the home, if you will, for that topic is in the association container.
That's brilliant, and that specifically applies to us very well, as my subgroup was reminded that our Holacracy partners spread full-time employees, part-time employees, some contractors, and quite a lot of volunteers, right?
Yep.
So that how much I as an individual invest and make available is, I like that that's the starting point. And,
yep, it honors.
Yeah,
it's a good example too of how it honors one of the 5 principles, autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Very,
so
very
you get to choose, as it should be.
Yeah.
And then there are consequences of those choices, right? So this isn't say the choice is without consequence, but you own your decision.
Excellent.
All right, so with the last few minutes, I think I will turn it back over to Eric and close out our session. And I will say thank you all for attending, allowing us to make this recording, which will be available. And I don't want to steal Eric's closing here, but I'm really excited to be working with the Holacracy community. I think this is so needed. And it's this community that probably better than any other really gets the power shifts that we're talking about and what's possible when we fully distribute authority to the endpoints. to provide individuals that autonomy and choice making, and to eliminate any personal power holding in our legal structures. So for me, I think this community is really key to enacting for purpose everywhere. So Eric, over to you.
All right, thanks, Tom. Yeah, and again, thanks to everybody for the call. It was, it was great. I learned a ton, and I think there was some really good dynamic conversation going on. We do have it recorded. We'll be posting it relatively soon after the meeting. It'll be available on our website and also via email. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and be tuned in to some additional sessions that we're going to be sharing sessions in our learning community. Some of the kind of momentum, I think, is around the association agreement. We feel that, and so there'll probably be some sessions soon on the association agreement. So great questions today. And on our website, go to our website. We do have some financial tool presentation that you can sign up for. I think it's like $30, but there's some great templates and some great sessions on the financial mechanics of what we're talking about in the for-purpose entity. So enterprise. Again, thanks for everyone for joining. Great conversation, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening.
See you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.